in the prior to the 4 years I was here prior, this group has been much more in tune to the need to grow that fund balance as a policy, and to make sure that we're getting to that 10% mark in as timely a manner as we can. So that as we look at 2012, as unexciting as it is to the public to drop money to the bottom line, it's part of our stewardship as elected officials to understand the bigger picture and to make sure that we do a good job explaining why that matters to the public, even if it's not as exciting as some new expenditure. But that's part of our role. Are there other questions on this?
Yes, Mayor. So to kind of dovetail off of what you were saying in terms of policy, then is there a what I would call a short-term, mid-term, long-term view? Would you call it a projection? However you would categorize it, that we are operating under right now as it relates to increasing our fund balance over the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years to get to to get to this point of 10%. I mean, how long do we think that it would take, barring any unforeseen incidents? I kind of say that tongue in cheek, to get to the 10% level.
You know, that's, I mean, our goal is to get to that 10%, obviously, as you stated. And of course, there's a difference here between you're looking at what the actual fund balance is and then what our budgeted fund balance is. So we're just, you know, at a close mark, really, for what we're projecting. We're a little bit behind this number, really, and what we're projecting just to get there for our budgeted fund balance. We haven't laid it out to say how much money we're going to let fall to the bottom line yet. I mean, because really, this is our first year, I would say, in doing budgets in past several years, that we've had a little bit of movement to go back and spend some money on some different programs and put some money to the bottom line. So I can't say 1 year establishes a trend as to where we are. You know, we are looking at some new revenues that'll come in 2017. I think those are the ones Commissioner Walker just alluded to, and the advantages of allowing some of that money to fall to the bottom line. And I know the Commission has made that statement before, that we can take out chunks of our need by 1 year letting it fall to the bottom line, then it stays there, and it's there the next year and the year and each year following that. So that's a good movement, and then it's seeing the positive increases of revenues flowing into the community, the other opportunities. We could set a goal of trying to, you know, I think that's probably one I would just say. I don't want to throw out an arbitrary number, but I mean, well, let's put $1 million more to the bottom line every year. Okay, well, let's base that in something as to what we're going to weigh that against as to other factors. And, you know, if we do that, you know, we'll cut that term down. We'll, you know, in the next 5 years, we've made up a lot of our need to get there.
All right, and I say on this listening tour, one of the things I say that usually is just to give people a realistic view of what $12 million represents. It's about 4% of our total budget, which is not as exciting a number as 12 million sounds like. And we could put all 12 million to the bottom line and get to 10%. We could put all 12 million into salaries and catch up. We could put all 12 million into infrastructure and maybe still be behind. We could put 12 million into a lot of things. So the balance we've got to find is that magic balance of how much do we put into tax reduction, how much into fund balance, how much into infrastructure, how much into salary. We've got to look at the big picture across the board. But it is a little depressing that we could put all of it just here and do that one job the first year. Now the good news is every dollar, that 12 million we put towards fund balance, we get to spend the next year because it comes back. It's not committed over time. It's dropped to the bottom line. So there's good news about dropping money to the bottom line. But it is part of our job is to weigh those options. But it's probably as the least exciting thing you can do with public money is drop it to the bottom line. So, all right. Anything else on this slide? We have other funds that we're going to review now.
This next slide just shows some of the other funds that we have either borrowed from or we have deferred payments from. So this shows the effort that we're making for this year and next year's budgets to replenish some of those funds or put money back into those funds, and shows the remaining balance of what would still need to be replenished to get them back to where they were.
So the numbers in parentheses are new money we've put in. Is that right?
Yes. For instance, the Employee Health Fund started out with deferred payments of about $4.8 million. From 2012 to 14, we put $850,000 back to that fund, and then in 2015 we are taking $2 million and putting it back to that fund. So we would still have a remaining $1.9 million
that we need to put back in.
Put back.
So that's the balance of deficit, not the balance in the fund.
Right. Right. That's correct.
Okay. Because the other one was the balance in the fund, so I have to switch my brain a little bit.
The 1 million, the 1.9 million is what would be left to be put back into the fund to replenish the amount of deferred payments that we didn't make.
Okay. Now the bottom one, is that right?
Yeah,
is the bottom one right?
The bottom one's slightly different. We're showing the cash position in that fund, and so that fund is actually operating at a deficit, and we're trying to get that back to a positive state. So the first three really are we've either borrowed money, transferred, or deferred payments, and those numbers represent the balance. And then the fourth one is we have a fund that we've underfunded, and we're trying to get a cash position back to zero or greater.
So is that about $11 million that's still needed to replenish all of those funds? Yeah. That's the math I just did, but not. Is that about right?
That's about right.
So we could put all $12 million on this page, or all $12 million on the last page, right? You with me? 1 year with this one we're done, 1 year with the next one we're done, so in 3 years we could do something else. It's a little depressing, but it's better that we know, right? We need to keep these numbers in front of us, and we need to keep them as part of our strategic plan. I will say our strategic plan this fall, we need to spend a lot of time, because next summer will be the first summer that we budget for the 2017, where we will have the new revenue. So our strategic planning this fall, it has to balance all of these things. Commissioner Walker.
Since you mentioned that, and it has nothing to do with the budget, when do you propose to establish a date for the fall?
Right away. I think we can start sending out emails to you all to start picking. This is one of the hardest topics in America, is to get 11 elected officials in the same room for 4 to 6 hours. So we'll need to, we'll begin that work, I think, probably right after the budget's done. We'll start sending out an email and try to establish that.
Because obviously, I'm sure other people do that. We have some plans for October.
You have plans? All right. I do too. All right. Any other questions on this?
This next slide just goes over, just spells out in detail the annual appropriation amounts that we talked about last week when we went over the general fund. We talked about the $12 million that we put in. We budget on the expense side as well as budget and offsetting revenue for the annual appropriation debt. This just details out what bond series are included in that in that 12 million.
All right. I didn't understand that.
Well, that was my question.
Okay, Commissioner Bynum doesn't either, so can you do that again?
The annual appropriation that we include in the budget for these series of bonds, there's TDD bonds as well as STAR bonds and the Speedway bonds. We have an annual appropriation backing to those bonds, so we're required to budget them. The payments are being covered with sales tax revenues. So we're not having to, they don't actually show up in our actual totals, but we're required to budget those amounts.
This was the accounting measure that we put in the budget, and we added the additional $6 million. A couple years ago, we did the other 6. You all asked for us to break this out in detail and show you what was being paid for under this, so this is the detail behind that.
The very last entry, the 1999 Speedway taxable series, that was the amount that we had not previously included in the annual appropriation. So that was the increase in the 2015 amount.
I thought Plaza at the Speedway, Walmart, etc. had TDD. Is that not correct? Or some
That is
entity
correct, but
out
there is no backing or anything tied back to that where we have to show it in our account.
Okay.
Is that correct, Lou?
Yeah, that's correct. On certain the bond issues for a TDD, for example, we may say that our only pledge is the project revenues, and if the project revenues are insufficient, that's to the detriment to the bondholders. In this case, our on these two financings, Happy Foods and Prescott, we said if the revenues are not there, the government will appropriate funds and cover any shortfall. So that's the difference, and it's really the level of government pledge.
And just to reiterate, we're not paying on any of these. All these projects are covering all of the expenses. So we budget revenue coming in and revenue or expenses going out on these because all these projects pay for themselves.
Okay, thank you.
And it is an important policy decision. When we go out and back a project, we can issue a TDD for someone, but whether or not we put our general obligation backing behind a project is a different decision, and it affects their ability to, it affects the interest rate that they can get. If we put our general obligation behind something, then basically we become the bank, and the bank's confident that we're going to cover it, and so we do it. So we're very careful about issuing general obligation backing, and it has to be a prudent decision, and we always go into these economic development deals with our eyes wide open. Are we general obligation bonding this, backing it, or not? Are we putting our full faith and credit behind this project or not? And that's a policy decision that we are very careful about, and our record with these has been very good because we've never paid anything for any of these bond issues.
Thanks, Mayor, for saying that, because that's exactly where I was going, because the more I thought about this, and this is one of the reasons why I asked for it, is I wanted to see actually how many good things we've done that are paying for themselves, you know, so I don't worry so much about our decisions to do more of these things. It gives me more confidence in our administration. So, thank you.
Commissioner Johnson?
So, as a matter of process,
I heard it too.
Okay, I thought it was just me.
It sounded to us like you said Commissioner Townsend, but then you started talking through both.
I said Johnson.
I know, you did, but it just the way.
Our ears, I'm sorry, we're sorry.
I heard it too, but I knew I had it.
Okay,
I heard it too.
Look, I can only mix up Walters and Walker. I can't mix up anybody
I'm
else.
not going to admit to that, huh?
do you want me to speak in a higher tone? Or?
Okay, I missed it. I didn't hear it. I didn't even hear it. Usually when I screw up, I hear it. If I screwed up, I apologize.
So this is in essence a guarantee, I suppose. I mean, I'm putting it in banker terms for these funds. And in terms of process, this appropriation just gets carried over into the next year, presumably, when we don't have to use them. They just get carried over for the next year's obligations.
Well, as far as showing up on our books, I mean,
Yes.
and there's differences on each one of these. I'll say the Star Bonds, the 2004 and 2012, you know, that's 3.9 million. That project's spinning off about 48 million annually. So yeah, that's a pretty good guarantee that we're not going to do anything, and we know it's almost paid off. So it's clearly there. The other ones, you know, the ones that are there for the Speedway, KSIC, which is a Speedway as well. I mean, those bonds, they go out long enough. You know, anything could happen. Yeah, they're very secure now. I think we have banked on that, Lou, a couple of years in reserve or something like that. And you know, and they've always covered for years. But
We're actually getting revenue in excess of the bond payments on the 99 issues, and approximately a little under $1 million a year. So it's which we build into the budget, and so that's money that's in excess that's required under the bond governing guidelines for those issues.
I think that's a key point. People don't, I think we're getting no tax dollars from the Kansas Speedway because it's on a tax exempt status. But as they filled all these buckets up, they filled up reserves, and as Lou just said, they're paying almost $1 million a year in sales tax that we get off that project because it overfunds. So that's pretty secure. I believe in your industry background, you'd probably classify it that way. I don't know what the backup is on Happy Foods and Prescott as far as the amount of money, but they're all, I mean, they've been, you know, early years on both those projects, they were very thin in terms of making it happen, but as they progressed, filled out the center at Prescott Plaza, it's filled out, has much more robust. The property tax value has gone up as well, so, you know, once they're established, they become much more secure.
We also, in an interesting sheet that we can look at again that commissioners have looked at for the last couple of years is looking at our TIF issues, because there was concern that our TIFs were upside down and they weren't working. The analysis we found is all of our commercial TIFs are doing fine. It's a handful of residential TIFs that predated one of the recessions, either 01 or 08, were the only ones that had struggled. So we have a very conservative track record of meeting our obligations and even generating more revenue. In our economic development deals, we've been very conservative in making sure that the deal pays for itself and then some. That's always our goal. There's really not much to use. Very few items are worth making a deal that doesn't pay money if we're not going to benefit from it. So I think this is a good reminder that we are doing very well in our economic development end, particularly on the commercial side.
Yeah, I'll just give you some additional magnitude on Happy Foods. Our annual debt payments are shown as around $14,000. The revenue from that project annually is about $50,000. So it's covering it more than 3 to 1. Prescott, the annual revenue is over $200,000. So again, the coverage is over 4 to 1.
And he knows all those numbers off the top of his head, which is impressive. All right, next item is debt.
The next two slides pertain to the city and county bond and interest fund. I went through this slide pretty quickly when we did the CMIP projects, just to show this is the city bond and interest fund, and this is the total number of our outstanding debt service payments, the debt service on our outstanding debt. The total here, if you were to look at the city bond and interest fund summary in your budget book, it would match to the 2015 and 2016 numbers, the total at the bottom. What I've done is broken it out by revenue source. The first line is the GO debt. All of the projects that are covered here are paid for strictly by property tax. The TIF payments are also paid by property tax, but they are paid with the TIF increment that comes from those developments. And then the other funds are mostly the enterprise funds, which do pay for their own. They do pay for their own debt with the revenue that comes to those funds. The graph that's shown below pertains to the highlighted line, just the GO portion, so that you can see where our debt payments are. For a while, we've had this $20 million target that we wanted to keep our GO debt service payments at $20 million or below. And you can see that we pretty much met that. We do start creeping up to that $20 million line in 2017 and actually extend. We've included in this graph estimates of our future debt service payments for 2016 through 2019 in this graph.
Commissioner Walker.
This is based on what assumptions for the years 16, 17, and 18 out? That we're not going to issue any additional debt, or is there a number in mind that you expect us to issue?
We built in that we would issue approximately 12 million. We would bond 12 million in projects per year. That's the amount that we've built in to those outer years.
So if we had an interactive system, we could then play with that and say, well, okay, what happens if we only issue 9 million? How does that affect 17, 18, 19? Have you done that?
Pardon me, say that
Have
again.
you done what number it would take us to reduce our annual bonded indebtedness to keep us below or at the $20 million threshold for the out years of 17 through 20?
I haven't done that. I do know that for each 12 million, it's approximately 960,000. That increases the annual debt per year by that number. We currently have, we know that we're going to have debt in the outer years. We've already got, I think, 67 million currently in outstanding temp notes that haven't gone to permanent financing yet. Those projects are currently in progress. So we know that over the next several years, those projects will go to bond, as well as we'll issue new temp notes for new projects.
I'm trying to relate it to a personal budget, a very small budget. And if you know that you're going to have those kind of increases in expenses, isn't it the prudent thing to do is to reduce what's driving that increase by not doing so much GO debt financing, which obviously means we don't do as many roads, bridges, infrastructure, etc. If it's in fact our objective to keep our debt no higher than 20, what's going to happen in these out years, I fear, is that debt increases, and it may even increase more than you projected. We're going to take money that's coming in that we ought to use for other things, and perhaps some of that could be GO debt financing substitute, that 12 million and whatever number that accretes to in the future, and we're not going to put it in the reserve fund because we're going to need it to keep from having to raise taxes in 17, 18, 19, like the history of the previous commissions were between 2003 and 2010, where tax increases were avoided only by depleting the reserve fund. Is that not correct? So would it be correct to say that to avoid breaching that 20 million, if that's going to stay the gold standard, we've got to somehow reduce the amount of debt we're incurring as we go on down the road?
And I will say we have done that. Probably prior to the recession, when we looked at the debt projects for the CMIP, our level each year for new projects was 18 to 20 million. We have reduced that. We're now down to the 13 to 15 million dollar range as to what we want to include for new projects every year. So we have reduced that.
I think, you're right on with what you're saying, Commissioner. I think we're faced with the practical reality of the fact that to do that, we'd probably be down to a couple $1 million of debt a year. And it'd be pretty hard to keep up with the infrastructure in our city. I would say we are limited right now. And when I sat down with our public works director and our county engineer and give them $12 to $13 million, which they don't get at all. It subtracts out other things to go into some of the different areas we have. It's pretty limiting. So it's an excellent point. Some of the things we have to look ahead as we're coming to these future years is, you know, you hope that with this many mills, your next slide has that up there, doesn't it?
Right.
You know, we have 16.5 mills that are allocated to the debt fund. You know, we were up to 17, and we moved that half a mil over to one of the other accounts. But if we were at 16.6 mils, if the community grows in value, the value of that mill increases. And that's a key thing that we hope that by, I shouldn't say hope, I mean based on our current trends, we'll see an offset in some of that by the time you get to 2018 and 19 where our expense comes up. But our alternative to that point is either the mill rate will have to go up to match what our fund balance will be, or we don't issue the debt.
All right, may I follow up with that?
Absolutely.
All right. It's certainly true that the mill increases in value if your community increases in value.
You can pull the mic closer.
I'm sorry. It's true that the mill, each mill becomes more valuable the more valuable your community is. However, what was the increase in our total assessed value in Wyandotte County? Do you have a slide for that?
We have seen it. I think it's in the book.
Well, it's probably in the book somewhere, but
Yeah, it was in your highlights, Doug. The increase was, I believe, 4.5%.
that was between 13 and 14,
Well, 14 to 15.
14 to 15. Has that, what, is that the norm, are we expecting that kind of continued growth, projecting out?
We're hopeful. Our 2015 valuation still remains below where we were at our peak in I think it was 2008. I don't know if you found that in the document. Well, in
CO 13.
Yeah, the peak was showing us at 1 billion. It's page 9 under my brief. So we were at the 1,270,000,000 mark for valuation.
I guess I'm getting at, if we increase 4.5%, then we're increasing our revenue stream roughly on $1 billion, $40.5 million a year. I mean, a little more each year because the number gets bigger, but using $1 billion is a round number. So you're anticipating that our value, the value of our tax levies in total will increase $40.5 million on $1 billion at 4.5% growth. Isn't that, am I
no,
No,
on
I figuring that wrong?
No, on 4.5% growth, we're going to get about $3 million additional in property tax revenue.
Totally.
Yeah,
3.5 million?
That's not all.
and
Okay, just trying to get a sense
Yeah,
of
the 4 point.
additional money coming in to address general obligation.
And if you look, you could even find it more on the CAO under the presentation that I did for the initial presentation on page 13. City valuation up by 4% equaled 1.1 million. And then county valuation up by 4.5% is 1.5 million. So that, I think that number, Lou, was our number.
those were general fund, the impact to the
That's
general
the
funds.
impact of the general fund. So
This one?
It's behind the county administrator message tab.
Okay.
so that's across, yeah, all our, the city general funds, you know, which would affect debt and the general fund. I mean, I will say 4.5%. I don't think, we're not projecting that. If you said, give me a 5-year projection, I wouldn't tell staff to, well, I'd let them give me their recommendation, but I would be surprised if they came back and said, we're going up 4.5% every year. We'll probably be more like a 2% type program.
Okay.
Lou, I'm also interested, if you go back to the bar graph, which, having looked at it for 8 years, I mean, I think I understand it. But this is the $20 million of debt payment that we make, is that right?
That's correct.
So how much debt does that represent?
Our outstanding, I think our current outstanding debt on the city general fund was like 278 million. Approximately.
Which is very close to 1 year's annual income. Is that right? Because we have about a $320 million budget now, $300 million budget. So our total debt is equal to about 1 year of our total revenue.
That's city and county?
That was just city. I think our county is county's a lot smaller. I know with total, you know, and that didn't include temp notes either. I think with total, with temp notes and our permanent financings, our total is around 300. I think it's around 390 million.
390. Okay.
That includes temp notes that have not gone to permanent financing yet.
That's a much scarier number than the 20 million.
Add to it the BPUs, which are, people are still responsible for in a different way.
That's right.
May I?
Commissioner.
So the reason I asked for this to be on the agenda is this topic, and specifically the $3 million of borrowing that's in the proposed budget, which is the gap funding item. And I liked the idea of the gap funding approach, but I was a little bit disappointed that we would be borrowing that money. I would be, I think, more interested in it if it were paid for out of operational funds. But this chart, I guess I have a question. Why don't you include temporary notes into the overall debt service? Wouldn't that give you a more comprehensive view of what our debt payments are?
Well, on the temp, usually the temp notes are issued for 1 year,
Okay.
and then we pay the full amount off. You could have a project, if we had a project that was 3 million and we only end up spending 1.5 million, then we would pay the other 1.5 million back, so it wouldn't be a full.
So if we just didn't go to permanent financing, we'd stay below our $20 million target? Just keep it all in tip notes?
I think when Debbie started on this, we said we built in estimates of how much we were going to bond for each of the next 4 years in projects, and we based those assumptions on the amount of outstanding temporary notes that we already have, plus the projects we're building into the budget.
Okay. Well, I did ask for an overall view of our debt, and I think this is the first time I'm seeing the years 2019 and 2020 going up so dramatically, which I think is not good policy. And I don't know that we can sit here tonight and strategize about this, because it sounds like it's already committed based on our past actions. But as I agree with Commissioner Walker, getting in a habit of just borrowing money for various projects, I think, has to be more carefully considered. Maybe we could take that up in our strategy session in September.
I think so. I think debt, if we came up with a 5-10-year plan on refilling fund balances, I think that would be helpful to have a plan in terms of what we would anticipate doing. And if we looked at a plan in terms of what we wanted to keep our debt service at, I think that would be
Yeah,
a
I think, but you know, that's a question. Should we pay off debt, or should we put more money in the bank? And I guess we would ask for some advice on that from our financial experts. But I think if I were to ask my constituents what they would prefer to be, you know, for their tax money to be used for. It's probably not to put money in the bank, as you said. And it's probably more beneficial in their mind to reduce our future debt.
Commissioner Townsend?
Well, the question I have, I was thinking about what Commissioner Walker was talking about and trying to keep the debt payment. Is the money for the long-term debt, say for fire equipment, public safety, is that included in this number?
The capital leases that we would do for the fire trucks.
Capital leases, and I'm thinking about what the chief was, his presentation to us a couple of nights ago about how we need to be considering, past considering replacing, you know, trucks, ladders, that type of thing. And I hear the concern about us not, well, trying to keep the lid on debt, but I'm just wondering, so I understand, would that type of debt, if and when we incurred it, be reflected here?
It is not. This is strictly projects that are financed with long-term bonds. The equipment that we purchase is a lease purchase, and those are shown. We pay for those with cash.
So there's no, okay, there's no long-term financing of
Not in these totals for capital equipment.
all right.
There is long-term financing, but we pay for it off cash. It doesn't come out of the debt fund each year.
Most of those are listed in the city general fund.
So it's out of our operating.
Commissioner Bynum?
I just need a question about Commissioner Walter's comment. When you speak to seeing the 19 and 20 years go up so dramatically, are you referring to the top line in the highlight versus the 2011 line, for example? I want to make sure I understand Commissioner Walter's comment. You said, sir, you said,
I thought you were talking to her.
I'm sorry, you had said, I want to make sure I heard what you said because.
That graph is graphing the GO debt, which is the highlighted yellow.
Okay, and because I'm looking at 2011 to 2020 and I'm seeing $3 million difference, and that's why I was trying to clarify what you meant by something going up so dramatically,
Well,
unless I don't
look at the
understand.
line on 2019 and 2020, how it grows from 2018, that's what I was referring to.
Okay, I mean, but,
And if we have a $20 million target, we missed it.
okay, that's true. I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what you were pointing out.
You got it.
Okay.
Commissioner McKiernan?
Well, and just another thing to point out on this graph is that the purple, especially on the very top from 2016 to 20, just kind of shows that we're projecting adding more payments than we're getting rid of as we pay off old debt. We're not retiring old debt as fast as we're adding new in those years. And so that's another kind of a strategy or kind of a policy direction that we've kind of spoken to here is, do we want to adjust the rate at which we add or adjust the rate at which we retire or both?
The other question too, it seems like every time we issue bonds, there's a refinancing of a set. Not quite every time, but it seems like that's a pretty common piece. And it's been because we've had such favorable interest rates that we've been able to do that. Do you anticipate as part of your projection the refinancing that you do on a regular basis as we issue new debt, or does this consider that there would be refinancing to keep it at this level?
Refinancing offers the opportunity to reduce future debt, and we've not built that into this model. So, but we're well aware that that opportunity presents itself. when we do a bond issue, and if it's for a 20-year period, they'll have the terms of that bond issue, they'll say they're callable after 10 years. And the higher interest rates are in the out years, so we have the ability after year 10 to refinance debt. So we have certain projects or bond issues from 2008 to 2010 that if interest rates are still favorable, we'll be able to refinance those and create a savings.
And potentially bring that purple line down
Yeah,
under
or,
the 20.
or we'll have the opportunity from what Commissioner McKernan just said, how we structure that debt, whether we want to structure it so we're paying more of the principal in the early years or defer it to the later years. But we'll certainly take advantage of lower interest rates if they exist.
Do we always bond for 20 years?
It depends on some issues. They're less than 20 years if the life of the project or the asset that we're borrowing is less than that. For example, the emergency communications project on the county level, I think those were 15-year bond issues, and because the life of the asset was less.
Okay. Which is why I don't like to lease finance police cars.
Yeah.
Because they're disposable. You should pay for cash with those because they're going to go away. 3 years and 3 years.
I'll just say, Debbie, could you jump back to the reserve? I think it was the very first slide we had on reserves. And we had the question about bond and interest fund that I think Commissioner Walters raised about why we have that, the level of reserves we have in this particular fund. And we realize it's a little higher level of reserves. It's not extraordinary, but it provides some security for that fund, but it also will allow us to stabilize the mill rate over the next 5 years. Also, our level of reserves will go down, but we'll be able to keep the mill rate constant.
This is a strategy I've been hearing from you all to keep that mill rate from going. So it's keeping this one flat, but putting money into the account so we can account for the years when we know we're going to have the higher payments. Unless we quit issuing debt.
Well, when you refinance, you're really just, even when you get a favorable interest rate, it's just like when you refinance your house. You're not shortening your debt, you're extending it out farther into the future. And yes, you save money on the interest, but only if you don't incur any more debt on top of that refinance. Because the refinance creates a little bit of space. It lowers the amount of your monthly payment, like on a house. Okay, that's great, but if you load up that house with more debt, you really haven't done anything to save any money. You've saved it on a specific bond issue, but you still have added more debt on top of it. And our practice has been to continually refinance for as long as I can remember us doing this. We'd refinance, we'd get a better interest rate, but we would extend the debt out another 10 years or 15 years. And then the very same year we did that, we would issue new debt on top of that, meaning that the payment that was actually required to service debt never really went down significantly. What it did was it gave us gap and breathing space to do more projects, more bridges, more roads, more construction. I note on this one, if I'm looking at it right, we had a little bit of a uncharacteristic drop between 11 and 14. Unless I'm looking at it from an angle and it didn't really drop. Did it drop some, the amount of our payment?
Well, those were difficult years, you might remember, and we structured our debt to reflect our revenue capacity. And so when we had new bond issues, we put less principal up front, knowing that our outlook was better in the future.
Okay. Well, it just seems like at some point we have to either pay more as we go or stop issuing so much debt if we want to keep to this policy. I don't know if there's anything magic about 20 million, or whether it ought to be 22 million or 18 million or what.
Yeah, we certainly haven't adjusted that number for inflation, so I think that number's a little artificially low to begin with. I think you're certainly correct. If we want to reduce the level of our future debt payments, we have to cut back on the amount of projects that we debt finance. That's clear. When we refinance, I'll just clarify though, when we refinance, if we have a debt that was issued for 20 years to begin with and we refinance it for in year 11, under law we can only refinance it for 10 years. We're not extending it another 10 years. So we're achieving that savings during the remaining life of that project, or of that debt financing.
And that's a real savings, except when you then go out and issue more debt on top of it.
That you're correct.
You're not getting ahead on the bottom line.
Well,
it's like having a credit card you pay off, but you go out and run up the other credit cards on top of it.
Yeah, this commission, certainly you can look at what projects are authorized in the CMIP, and you as a commission have the opportunity to say we want to reduce the amount of debt issued, and we can strike projects from the CMIP. I don't want to speak for the administrator, but that's certainly an option.
I would speak for myself. I understand that, but I look at the CMIP project and those that we actually do. There aren't any feel-good luxury projects. You know, we're not building swimming pools for people who need them. We should.
Hopefully, we're going to build one.
Yeah, and we're not building unnecessary infrastructure. We're doing what we absolutely have to do. And so it's hard when you're looking at CMIP to say these aren't great projects. But what we're not seeing is at the time we're approving these, we're not able to say what is this impact on this. We don't get this chart until this time of year.
Well, to say it's going to be the same, we get it. It's the same chart we've had every year. So
I know. I'm just saying when you look at CMIP and you're trying to decide the priorities, you know that doesn't give you a picture of, well, this ought to be number one. I know. Say we ought to buy 10 fire engines. That's a feel-good project. We're getting good stuff out there, but I don't get to see what that does 15 years out. I don't have that ability, I'm sorry, to, in my mind, conceptualize how that impacts our debt and our mill levy. There is no interactive data system available to me to judge each decision that we make in terms of the impact. But once a year, we see what the end result is. And so, yeah, I'm more inclined to say we do less, even though they're very needed. We're creating a burden for future generations of not only commissioners but the taxpayers of this community. And at some point, you got to say enough's enough. I don't have an answer. It just seems like you can't go on forever living in debt.
well, if it would comfort anyone to know, the city of Leawood issues no debt, ever.
I did not know that. I would have assumed they paid it off the first year if they did, but.
So, all right. Any other questions about debt? We need to keep, this is something we need to keep in front of us. And when we do strategic planning, we need to keep the fund balances in front of us. We need to keep the debt service in front of us. It's very easy to spend our time in strategic planning thinking about the exciting projects we want to do. We have to keep our eye on this bottom line. So this, I anticipate this community will continue to carry a debt load into the future. The question is, what is an appropriate debt load that we can manage and fund appropriately? That's the question. I would be surprised if any time in the future we go to a zero debt service program. But I think from a policy question, and this is something we could look into even for our strategic plan, if we looked at communities across the country, we looked at what the the rating companies tell us, what is a typical bond payment or a typical debt carry for a city of our size and our budget. I think that would be an interesting benchmark to kind of look at how other communities are doing it so we can get an idea. Do we have way more debt than anybody else? Do we have way less debt than anyone else? Are we kind of in the middle of the pack? I think that would be helpful to try to benchmark ourselves. And of course, it would depend on the age of the city. The older the city, the more infrastructure it needs. So, Commissioner Bynum?
Just to back up one step, I guess. With that conversation in mind, how does the second line TIF play in? I mean, just a couple of sentences on if we want to keep in mind this conversation around debt. Just help me understand how the TIF line factors into that. Is
Well,
that another item that we would want to also take up in a strategic planning session in terms of projects that we authorize a TIF for?
I mean, it relates. It's not fact, I mean, she only has the yellow line is the only thing you're seeing that we're talking about that's funded from that debt fund.
I see.
So if we have to fund TIF projects and build money for those, we fund those off of the cash side? Are they coming off the general fund or a special project?
No, the TIF projects are still debt funded. That the total at the bottom is our total debt service payment. I've reclassed them differently because we get TIF increment to pay for the debt service on those bonds. But
So
they're still long-term bonds.
I would actually probably argue that the strategy behind the TIF project is one where you're creating value in the community. You may be lengthening, you may have a 10-year period, a 20-year period before you get, but you've gone from a piece of property that had a good example is the Village West area. When we started on that 400 acres, we collected about $250,000 in taxes. It didn't have a TIF because we collected property taxes right away. We collect about $12 million off that property now. But if you go into an area that has relatively low property taxes, you do a TIF on it, 10 to 20 years down the road, then that property is now generating real dollars. When Prescott Plaza pays off its TIF, our government will recognize a whole new, it'll bump in value because that whole plaza will all at once come back on the tax roll.
So it is a form of debt financing. However, it
Pays for
the
itself.
things we have going on now are paying for themselves.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on debt? To be I think all we can say is to be continued, yes? This conversation will be continued. Contractual services. Mr. Bach?
All right, this is a question asked, and I'll have Mr. Tobin come up to the microphone for this one if you'll put up the slide for it. When we looked at our building and logistics, just how much money are we spending on an annual basis? So we looked at last year and to determine whether this is a topic we want to readdress. If we think it is something, it may be something we want to spend a future time in the fall looking at. I think when we dug into it, it's actually somewhat disappointing how little money we do spend on outside contractual services, but I'll turn this over to Mike Tobin, our Interim Director of Public Works, and you can discuss this, Mike.
Mayor, Commissioners, please note that this is contractual services for maintenance work that's performed by in-house staff. Since I've been in this building, which is quite some time, we've always had skilled tradespeople that have worked for us, from the carpenters, the electricians, the plumbers, the painters, all of those union groups. And as we moved into this building and it became a more complex operation, we also had mechanical and HVAC skilled tradespeople. The number on the bottom, I'll start down there because that's an average salary for those 8 employees that we have that fit that category. They work on all of our buildings, but principally they work on the 8 major buildings that are our biggest entities and that house the most employees. This building, the courthouse, etc. The number on the top, the 93,000, That is work that is performed by outside contractors for maintenance in those buildings. Some of it is the result of annual maintenance agreements. Most of it is the result of HVAC work. Because when the seasons change and you have buildings as old as the courthouse and the court services building, the requirements for example, the courthouse has, I believe, 7 different HVAC systems in there. There's no centralized heating and cooling in that building. So staff just could not keep up with that. Only a small portion of that 93,000 is for non-HVAC work. It's about 10 or 12,000 is all. Also, the number on top, the contractor's cost, does not include projects. If we have a total remodel project, such as what was done in the health department a couple of years ago, or one that if we were going to redo part of a floor in this building, those costs would be covered in a different area. Any questions?
Well, I brought the question up because, and I'm certainly pleased but a little surprised that that number is so low. How much of the remodeling expenses do you believe could have been done by in-house people? We used to have people that did that in-house.
Well,
I believe the legal department, when I was there, was remodeled by in-house people.
yes, and they do quite a bit of it, Hal. And yes,
Mike, actually, the health department, I believe, was all in-house, wasn't it?
yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Oh, good. Good. I'm glad to hear that.
But I know when we did some, in this building, I think we had a lot of outside contractor work. I mean, all the windows being replaced, stuff like that. There was a great deal of expertise, different kind of work that came in. So it's probably project-based.
Could I ask Mr. Tobin a question? Kind of relates to maintenance. It's not related to these, and he doesn't have to answer it tonight, but we do have constituents that watch this program. People unable to sleep and so forth. And I was called about our bridge maintenance, and
You want you closer.
I was called about our bridge maintenance, and if I understand correctly, the question that was being asked was the extent to which we allocate resources to maintain or clean out the draining. The way it was explained to me was we have bridges in which small trees and shrubs are growing out of, and that we don't always clean them out. You know, the debris that collects in there, a weed, a tree seed, something will happen. It's wet, it accretes more and more, and it becomes somewhat of a solid block. Then when we put ice, when we get ice, and we put salt on it, it won't drain the salt, and the salt then rusts out the drain, and this process is a several-year process. I didn't have the answer for the individual, so if you have an answer, I'd appreciate it, because obviously if the bridges don't drain, we're replacing drains on a regular basis. How do you maintain the drains? What is it that we are doing or not doing?
We try to maintain those, Commissioner, on a regular basis. We don't, it's part of the street cleaning operations. We run those street cleaners over all of our bridges, and it's part of the handwork that they're supposed to do to follow that up. To the best of my knowledge, I think we do a pretty good job of it. Certainly, you'll notice even at this time of year, especially with as much rain as we've had, you can even see some greenery coming out of the catch basins or between the curb and the street, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's hard to control. The use of more sand since the crash in '08 and because of what the state of Kansas has done to us is also part of this problem, because when you use a lot of sand instead of all salt like we used to, the sand collects in the pipes, in the drains. It maintains the seeds, holds them in there, and not just the seeds, but also the debris. And then eventually, quite a bit of it in the eastern section of the county ends up in our sanitary sewer facilities.
I don't know what kind of, I mean, okay, thank you for the answer. I don't, just maintain those bridges.
And maybe on your,
And I think the
So
gentleman-
noted.
The gentleman was very serious and he was knowledgeable. I mean, I'm not making any light of it at all. It's just simply his belief that we could do a better job of cleaning out those drains on those bridges, especially the bridges, and because of the salt. So take a look at that, will you, please?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mike, also, as you mentioned the sand, we have increased our salt budget, Reggie, Mike, back up to the levels where we used to be, so not really a highlight topic that we've talked about, but I mean, we're back to the point where our mixes won't be so heavy in sand. Is that correct? Or are we still down on that a ways?
No, we're still down. We're back to, we're better, but we'll still be using, I'd say 25–30% sand, where we used to not use any at all.
Okay.
And please note that a lot of that is due to the fact that the salt was always purchased with special city street and highway money, which the state has cut drastically.
All right. That brings us to the end of our agenda tonight. I know there's a sadness that moves across the room when we run out of topics for tonight.
You can feel that.
What's that?
You can feel the sadness.
I can feel the sadness. We have a full agenda geared up for Monday, starting with a 5 p.m. Public budget hearing. We are required by law to do a public budget hearing prior to the adoption. We previously did our first public budget hearing in May. Well, we used to do it in May and learned that there was no way to respond to the public budget requests in May, so we bumped it back to February. So now the last 3 years we've done it in February, so we have time to look at that, and then we have our final public budget hearing. So anyone out there in TV land who wants to come on Monday at 5 o'clock to express your interest in the budget, you're welcome to do that. And then immediately after that, that will be in the commission chamber. And whatever time that ends, and that depends on how many people show up, I have been to 30-minute budget hearings, and I've been to 3-hour budget hearings. And so we will see how many people come. But then we'll come up from that to our budget workshop. And then we have a budget workshop scheduled at 5 o'clock on Thursday the 30th that currently has no agenda items. But that is our safety gap should we need it, whether if we don't finish what's on here or if over the weekend when you're having trouble sleeping, you come up with another topic that you want to discuss for the budget hearing. But we will provide an order of these. I don't know that we'll go in exactly the order listed on this bullet section, but we may prioritize those in terms of the ones that have the most decision relevant, immediate decision relevant for this budget. Some of these things we may not be able to do much with this budget season, so we can push it back a little bit. But we'll keep that in order. And if you have additional items, let me know now.
Mayor, I spoke to you this morning, and I think since the county fair is going on, I don't have to discuss the county fair issue during the budget, but I don't want to be told next month that if we bring up the county fair, we're too late and we got to wait until next year's budget to do anything about it. I've had meetings with George Brakovich, who I think has met with some of the commissioners. He has at least proffered a plan, a possibility of how to address what my concerns are, at least, regarding the county fair and its current status and what I feel is the county's obligation to the fair.
Let's. I would suggest we leave it on the agenda for Monday, and at least talk about the scope of of where we are.
Mayor, one more comment.
Yes.
So we got a presentation tonight about debt, and I think I know a little bit more about the bigger picture. So if I were to want to discuss further this $3 million gap funding and any potential alternatives to borrowing money to do that, when would an appropriate time be for that?
I think we put it on the agenda for Monday.
All right.
And I would put it at I would move it up the list to make sure, because that would be a budget decision that would potentially affect our adoption.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.